working with Harvard for all the great work you're doing. Thank you so much for joining. I'll share my screen and we'll get going. Actually, if you could do me I think I still need a access there, Cassie. But
oh yeah, sorry. There you go.
No worries. So yeah, thanks for tuning in virtually, everyone. I of course would appreciate if we were in person and look forward to the day where we can do this together. But in the meantime, I'm more than happy to answer all the questions, present the information, and to tell you what's up with that bike lane via Zoom. Can you see my title slide here?
Yes.
Excellent. Great. So again, thanks Cassidy and the team for having me here. My name is Galen Mook. I'm the Executive Director of MassBike. We're the Massachusetts Bicycle Coalition. We're a statewide organization that focuses on a lot of big picture stuff, policies, funding, legislation, kind of the broader work. But because all biking is local, I definitely want to plug in the best I can with what's going on with your ride. So I'm here to give you a little bit of a overview of some of the broader picture and some of the specifics of what's going on with a bike lane, how a bike lane comes into to be, and then talk about some of the other issues that might come up around bicycling advocacy that I deal with on a day-to-day basis at MassBike. Just a little bit of my background. I live in Alston, so just across the river from Harvard Square, but I'm kind of in the backyard of the expansion of Harvard's campus. I've been here in the Alston community about 15 years, and I've been at this role at MassBike for about 2 years. But before that, I founded a nonprofit called Common Wheels, which some of you may have encountered. We set up a pop-up bike repair shop outside of the Barry's Corner area by the Trader Joe's sometimes. And as Cassidy mentioned, we do a lot of work one-on-one with a lot of folks riding with the Commuter Choice Program. So not only are we talking about legislation and broader picture stuff, but if you want to talk any specifics, feel free to throw it in the chat and the Q&A as well. And then I'll also lean on John, who is a great resource for a lot of the very specifics of what's going on as well. Today, we're going to talk a bit about the differences between the state, federal, the municipal, and the institutional side of bike advocacy. We'll talk about some of the programs and policies that are in place that you should know about, which we can utilize in order to get bike lanes. We'll talk about crashes, what happens when you crash, some resources to follow up if you are ever in a crash. We'll talk locally about Cambridge major projects. And then I have about 38 slides of different types of bike lanes, which I'll breeze through very quickly, but to give you a sense of the varieties of bike infrastructure that's out there. And I do want to leave room at the end of this hour for questions. So please feel free to pepper them throughout. I don't want to prescribe anything that you should know. If you are curious about anything in particular at any point in time, go ahead and throw it at me. I will say that I can't really see the Q&A when I'm doing my shared screen, so I'll lean on Cassidy and John and Sharon and the team to feel free to interrupt at any point. Cool. That said, this is a packed presentation. This is also the first time I'm giving this presentation, so we're refining this to suit the needs of Harvard the best we can. But bear with me. We're going to fly through some information to learn what's up with that bike lane. So to start, I'd like to frame the conversation into talking about some of the major agencies and institutions that we deal with on a broad level to deal with the policies and funding that come in. The ones that we deal with locally in the state mainly are the Department of Conservation and Recreation, the Mass DEP, which is the Department of Environmental Protection, and the Mass DOT. So you'd say, why is a parks, why is an environment, and why is a transportation kind of coming together? Because bikes really do fit all three modes. Those Venn diagrams certainly overlap when we're talking about bicycling. A lot of funding and a lot of design right now in 2020 in Massachusetts are dictated and come from the state level. Even though Cambridge is a little bit ahead of the curve and Boston might be a little bit ahead of the curve, we are dealing with 351 municipalities in the state, and there is one overarching body that really does oversee laws and practicalities of the roads, and that's the state legislature, which is backed by the administration. So the administration under the DCR, Mass DOT, and Mass DEP really do follow what's prescribed by the laws in practice through the regulatory process. There's a difference between statute and regulations, and the regulations are really where things come into practice, which with the DCR, you can think about, it's the river pathway along the Charles River. If you're ever out by the Weeks Foot Bridge or along the pathway along campus, that's DCR property. or DOT, which dictates a lot of the funding that goes in to fix the bridges, fix the potholes, fix the striping that goes on, say, JFK Street. And then the Mass DEP is in concern because you can't have a construction project these days without Department of Environmental Protection stepping in. That said, a lot of these are overseen by the Department of Transportation in DC, where most funding comes from. There's a bunch of different funding sources. I do not have a slide that dictates that. That's its whole hour-and-a-half presentation altogether. But you should know that a lot of funding comes from highway safety programs and transportation alternative programs, which count in the hundreds of millions of dollars, which just Massachusetts reaches, which we can tap into project by project to make sure that we get the proper bike lane, the proper striping, the proper pavement, the proper pathway built, comes from an overseeing of the federal side, mainly through funding, which is overseen by these three, DCR, Mass DOT, and Mass DEP. Now that said, there's a lot of overlap. Some of that overlap we're seeing much more beneficially in the current administration under Governor Baker. I will give props to the current governor for creating a few key programs, namely the Complete Streets and the Mass Trails program. So Mass Trails, I'll talk about on this slide, it's kind of a combination of the Mass DOT, the DCR, and the EEA. The EEA, I'm sorry for all the acronyms. I really should have a glossary here, but the EEA is the Energy and Environmental Affairs. So you can think of Mass DOT as the Department of Transportation. You can think of the DCR as the Conservation and Recreation. And you can think of the EEA as the Energy and Environmental Affairs, being three legs of the stool that build our bike pathway network. Mass Trails is a relatively new interagency coordination where these three agencies are sharing resources, are sharing permitting problems, are sharing funding sources, are sharing design guidelines, so that the DOT, the DCR, and the EEA are collaborating so that we can build specifically a trails program. And you can think of these as the off-road trails. In Cambridge, it's important because this will be what goes to help fund, design, implement, permit, construct, and maintain the Charles River Pathway, which currently is under a design process for Memorial Drive. Or if we're going to connect the Minuteman Pathway into Harvard Square, or if you're familiar with connecting the Fresh Pond area in Cambridge to the Arsenal area in Watertown, there's going to be a pathway that's constructed this year. All of that would be under the Mass Trails purview, which follows those three, DOT, DCR, and EEA. I'm sorry if this is a little wonky. I do get to be more practical in a second, but I do want to create the framework of how complicated some of this stuff can look like. On the slide here, you'll see that we have a map of the trails in the area of the greater Boston area. The greens, the browns, and the blues, those are all bike infrastructure, which are overseen and generally funded by the DOT, which are permitted and designed by the DCR, and then are allowed or disallowed by the EEA. So it really is an interagency coordination. And the beauty of what's going on right now is that under Governor Baker, every other week, these three agencies sit down to talk about Mass Trails specifically. And they say, hey, we really need to get this permit through so we can pave the rest of the Northern Strand Trail, for instance. So though it's DOT money and a DCR design, the EEA can say, hey, well, we'll get that permit in through. And before, under former governors, there was a siloing, and a lot of organizations or institutions, I should say, departments, would kick the problem to another department. Now we have one stop to go to say, as an advocacy organization, or as personal advocates, or as institutional advocates, you can say, hey, Mass Trails, can you help get this through? Additionally, along that similar framework, we're seeing the Complete Streets program, which is a Mass DOT, Department of Transportation, funded program, which actually goes towards municipalities. Now, this is a very important concept because a lot of roads, sidewalks, and roadways, pavement, are actually municipally controlled, even though the funding to get them repaired, restriped, and rebuilt comes from the state. Now that affords the ability for the state to say, hey, if we give you money, you have to build to our standards. This is something that's pretty brand new. The MassDOT Complete Streets guidelines, including the separated bike lane, planning and design guideline, they're really only about 3 or 4 years old. The funding does come from the State House, but it's implemented through the administration, specifically the DOT, which forces municipalities who might not have good standards of bike lanes, might not have planning departments, might not have agencies within the municipality to get up to code. they can lean on the DOT guidelines. And if they do that, they can get DOT money, which is the hook. That's the incentive. If you can tell a municipality like, hey, Newton, you know that $10 million project? We can get $10 million from the state if you build a bike lane and connect it to transit and build a nice little bump out and a protected crosswalk. But if you just build it to the standards which you're used to, you're not going to get any of that money. That allows advocacy organizations to really use DOT guides to say a municipality needs to bump up their improvements for biking and walking. Doesn't really matter for Cambridge necessarily, because Cambridge is already at the edge, the far edge of that bell curve, as is Boston, as is Newton, so that might have been a bad example. But it allows us a little bit of a hook to say, hey, you know, Westboro, Athol, or wherever you're zooming in from right now, if you're from a little bit out of the greater Boston area, chances are your town or your city might not have a robust planning department. And this allows us to lean on the DOT to say, hey, we've got guidelines in place that we want as advocates to get a better bike lane. We even have a separated bike lane design guide that if you implement with this project, we can get funding from a complete street standpoint. It's a little bit of a competitive process, so I won't get into too much of the weeds, but the beauty is that the funding is allocated by the State House, implemented by the DOT, and you can see across the state on this map, the greens are where Complete Streets programs have been implemented from a municipality standpoint. The yellows are where they're in process, and I think we're at about 60% of the state has a design policy that is accepted by municipality to say we are a Complete Streets municipality. Therefore, when we repave, when we restripe, we have to take biking and walking into consideration. That's step one of becoming a Complete Streets certified municipality. I'm sorry for all the information, but I just really wanted to make sure that this is a very important development, which is a policy development, which is backed up by funding in order to get good designs, which make better bike lanes happen. Cool, I'll take a breath. Moving on, that's the overarching state and a little bit of the federal making its way down to the municipal. On a local level, I said before, most roads and sidewalks are municipal jurisdiction. I think up to the point of about 80% of the state's paved roads are municipal. And I think it's something along the lines of like 96% of the sidewalks are municipal. So if you're talking about how do I get a bike lane on this road, chances are you start at a local level. So I've got the map of Cambridge here, and I just use this as an example because they've rated their streets in terms of stress. And because Harvard is in Cambridge, well, I guess half of Harvard is in Cambridge, I'm using this example. But you can see that most bike infrastructure is a local concern, which makes our lives harder when we think regionally, because you'll see this map, Somerville just disappears. Boston just disappears. But of course, biking is regional as well as local. So my job at Mass Bike is to make sure that the Somervilles and the Cambridges are talking. So when Cambridge has a bike plan, it meshes with the Somerville bike plan. It meshes with the bridges that go over the Charles River, which are state bridges, which meshes with the Boston bike plan. I'll get into little nuances differently in a second, but just so you know that most issues, though they're funded mainly from other sources, their decisions are made locally, which is important for Cambridge. And then you have an institutional approach. This is a little slide to talk a little bit about Harvard here. This is a snapshot of Harvard's institution as it is in Alston currently. And I use this example because this is actually a really tricky situation of what Harvard's got going over here. The land is institutional, so it's not even really a municipal decision. A lot of the decisions of what happens at the Harvard Business School actually are Harvard-owned decisions. The roads, the sidewalks are actually Harvard-run sidewalks, which is why a program like Commuter Choice is so important, because you have your own power to have shuttle buses. You have your own power to build a cycle track, which Harvard is paying for and instituting in front of the new engineering building in Alston. It's really amazing because you can get institutions out at the forefront, which can even leapfrog over the local and leapfrog over the state and even leapfrog over the federal, because God bless you, you've got your own endowment, you've got your own funding, you can utilize it. So even though I did lay out a little bit of that framework in those prior slides, when you get to the institutional level, it even becomes a more, well, complex, but also the opportunities expound themselves. So just as an example here, I wish I could point with a laser slide. I can't really show, so I'll describe on the image here. But the green is what's already there. So you're looking at the Harvard Business School area, you're looking at the athletic fields, you're looking at the stadium. The light green are just a little bit to the left of this map, right next to where it says Barry's Corner. That's actually a city park called Smith Field, which is city owned. So Harvard, though, supports it financially, the decisions get made at a city level. But just a little bit to the left of that city park, again, is institutional land. That goes back to Harvard land. If you go to the far, far left of this map, that green by the river, that's actually state property. So you're dealing with, again, DOT, DCR, and EEA, if you want to tackle that section. Going a little bit further south in this image, you'll see what's going on with the C's, what will soon be the whole new complex, which is that basically wedged in between Western Avenue and Cambridge Street. That will be Harvard institution at this point. However, it's going to have local roads go through it, which means that the city of Boston has zoning rights over what happens there, which has basically a way to hold Harvard accountable to make it to city standards, even though Harvard's already well beyond city standards, it's not a concern. But there's a little bit of beholdenness there. And then if you go a little bit further south, that becomes the Massachusetts Turnpike on and off ramps. So you're dealing with the state again. Even though Harvard owns the land, the state is leasing it, which involves federal highway, which involves also the Charles River Park, which is the DCR and EEA, which involves, God bless, the Army Corps of Engineers, because it's a historic watershed. So my example of this one snapshot is the complexities of layers of advocacy that are needed. So if you want to say, get a bike lane on what will be a new road that connects the Harvard Business Campus down to what will be West Station, you're dealing with Harvard, of course. Then you're going to be dealing with the city of Boston. Then you're going to be dealing with the Mass Highway, because it's the on and off ramp. Then you're going to be dealing with Federal Highway, because this is an interstate. Then you're going to be dealing with the train tracks down there. I'm sorry, I didn't even mention that earlier, which involve federal transportation and the MBTA. And then you're going to be dealing with all of the ecological impacts of how this transportation system then impacts the parkland and the environment. So I just use this to say that though the institutional has the power, because though Harvard has the ownership of the land and the funding to kind of do what they need to do, they need to go through all of those layers of involvement in order to make a simple bike lane, hopefully a protected bike lane, happen. So, it gets complex. So I'm sorry to lay it on you, but my presentation gets easier as we go through. Cool. Any questions so far? I know that I just laid a lot of foundation there. Anything coming through yet, John or Cassidy?
Looking good.
Great. So let's talk about some major projects. There's a lot of major projects going on. I just talked a little bit about the Alston expansion of Harvard, which involves not just the Beacon Yards area and the realignment of the Turnpike, but how the institution's actually going to knit itself together. Some other major projects you might want to pay attention to in Mount Auburn Street. The City of Cambridge is doing a corridor safety improvement study right now, which may involve a bus lane, may involve a bike lane, may involve some protected bike lanes. You may have seen some innovative, quote, pilot infrastructure go in on Mount Auburn Street recently, right south of the Smith Center. That was just this season. I'm sure we're all familiar with what happened on Brattle Street 2 years ago, where they basically, City of Cambridge is, quote, piloting again a two-way protected bikeway on Brattle Street, which is tricky because it's a one-way street. And then we're seeing this example here where it's a parking protected bike lane, which is just north of campus, right around the Natural History Museum and just north and east of the quad. So there's a lot actually happening in and around Harvard. I didn't want to make the full list because I don't want to prescribe that everything is set in stone, but I do want to say from the biggest to the smallest, there are some changes happening that are impacting Harvard, which is actually really important because the beauty of having a responsive institution like Harvard and a responsive municipality like Cambridge is that you can do pilots and you can try things out which will be at the benefit of the users. We're also seeing a lot of other things pop in like blue bike stations, bike racks that are coming in that are corrals on street, bike repair stands that are collaboration of the institution because it's institutional property, but at the request or the funding or the project of the city. So there's a lot of collaboration that's going on. In Cambridge, in Alston, where I live, we're seeing Harvard actually put a lot of innovative infrastructure down, such as a protected bikeway in front of the soon-to-be opened engineering school, which is really cool. And I meant to go get some photos of those new snazzy protected bike racks that are in this awesome indoor cage in front of the engineering building. So there's a lot of projects and programs happening, mainly because Harvard is redeveloping and expanding. I also should mention that there's programs that are going to be connecting the Longwood campus to the Harvard Square campus, which will intensely involve what this graphic is here of the Beacon Yards map, because you can think of the desire line of what's going on from Harvard is, of course, the Harvard Square campus through to the Alston area of the business school, through to the Beacon Yards area of what will be West Station, which is going to be a multimodal commuter rail, bus, and bike and off-street pathway connecting, and then a little bit further south to the Longwood area. So it's very important that Harvard pays attention to the nuances of the players and to say, even from the grandest scale of a redesign of a turnpike interchange to the smallest scale of, can we just flip the bike lane and the parking lane? Harvard is actually at the forefront of a lot of these conversations, and they're happening. They're happening right now. Some of these are going to take decades, and some of these are going to take literally just a couple of months. And I'll peg here that upcoming this Thursday, there's a community meeting involving the Mount Auburn Corridor Safety Improvement Project, which, if you want to, you can go ahead and take a snapshot of the slide. But on August 20th from 6 to 8 p.m. via Zoom, you can plug in and find out what's going on Mount Auburn, which is, you might not be coming to campus right now, but when you do come to campus, you will be impacted very directly. So just a little hit to say things are happening now.
And Gail, and the final note on this one, which we know is moving forward, is the Quincy DeWolf corridor north-south, which will also intersect with the Mount Auburn Street corridor study. That one, Mount Auburn is still under discussion, but the Quincy DeWolf one is in planning and construction now. I think I heard there was some mobilization happening just outside of Gund. And so we're very excited about that one moving forward. Not quite what everybody wanted, but I think it's going to be very good, and that's going to allow protected reverse direction north from the river, so from the river up to the Oxford Street corridor, and then semi-shared lanes down south toward the river corridor. So that's going to be a significant improvement for that north-south travel.
Awesome, that's going to be great. You're basically going to be able to connect essentially the Sciences building in the quad there, protected all the way to the river. So, and beyond. So yes, so this slide is just a drop in the bucket of what's going on around your neck of the woods. Cool. And I should have prefaced this presentation by saying I'm not really talking so much strategy here. I didn't want to prescribe that I know a way of advocating. It's also everything's in flux. So if you want to follow up on any of these projects, I've got my contact info, and Cassidy can share this too. I got it at the end of this presentation, but MassBike has its hand in a lot of this work, along with our partners at Harvard, at Livable Streets, at Walk Boston, at the Boston Cyclists Union, et cetera, Cambridge Bike Safety, and a bunch of other organizations that are involved. So keep in mind that I'm not necessarily gonna go into too much of the details project by project in this presentation. This is more of an overview of a 101, even though this feels like a graduate level presentation I'm talking about so far. Cool. What else has been really cool are seeing the pilot going on of the COVID conversation. This itself is a whole other hour-long presentation, but I've broken it down into certain phases of what we're seeing in terms of infrastructure that are responding to what's going on in real time without much planning during the COVID time. So those of you who've been following the news, we're seeing responses based off of the low traffic volumes and the high need to get out of your house and create distance. So obviously, a 5-foot wide bike lane, which is the standard minimum width of a bike lane, is not enough if you're going to be trying to have a 6-foot separation between people if you're going to be passing somebody in a bike lane. A 7-foot wide sidewalk is not wide enough to have somebody walk bidirectionally and pass somebody while maintaining 6 feet of space. So we are realizing in very real stark terms that our current guidelines for infrastructure, though they are pretty good in normal stands, are not enough during times of needing physical distance during COVID. So we're seeing different phases of the realization of transforming the public space to facilitate physical distancing. So what we saw, and I'll breeze through this slide, what we saw mainly in phase one, which was almost an immediate response, was mainly the Department of Conservation and Recreation opening up recreational opportunities because parks were closed, pools were closed, gyms were closed, everything was closed. People were going stir crazy, and we saw a mass influx in the parks, which made parks a danger to public safety. So the way to get around that was the DCR basically said, okay, we're gonna maybe limit parking at the parks, which affords us more space, maybe another 8 to 10 feet of space next to sidewalks and parkways. So this top photo here is by the Linway, which allowed basically for a dedicated de facto protected bike lane to pop up adjacent to a sidewalk to allow for recreational opportunities, which was great. That was phase one. Other examples like that in phase one were basically similar for recreational purposes. This was back when the general guidelines from everybody was stay home, please, please stay home. Phase two, we saw, okay, well, business districts have to open up because we need to expand our restaurants, we need to expand our retail, otherwise everybody is going to lose their job, which is sadly is kind of already happening. Which that bottom image, though it's not from here, this is actually from Milwaukee, this is a way of expanding a street space, which is a public way, by the way, paid for by your taxes, to make it so it's actually suitable not for driving or parking, but for an expansion of businesses. Just to say, hey, we can create some outdoor space. It's okay during the good weather. We'll see if this holds during the rougher winter season, but this is what phase two looked like. Phase three, kind of that bottom left, were the slow streets and neighborways, where basically we were seeing the pressure valve of people needing to get out of the house, but yet still distance. So this is a rendering, so it's not actually a real image, but this is what's been going on in Arlington, in Somerville, in Cambridge, to a lesser extent in Boston, a little bit in Newton, but the idea of saying like, hey, we need to actually close down some roads to throughways so that they can get back to being a neighborhood resource of getting out of the house. This has actually been something that advocates have been advocating for a better part of since I've been here, since like longer than a decade, of like, hey, Google and Waze are sending people through my neighborhood street during congested times. How do we actually prevent that? COVID is the excuse, not to say there's a silver lining because we are in the middle of a terrible global pandemic, but it allows us to create a new framework to rethink how streets are used. So we're creating slow streets and neighborways. This is the conversation that's being implemented now. We're basically in phase three of that conversation of thinking the street space. Phase four is really going to be about economic recovery, not just for restaurants and for business districts, but how can we really rework the public space so that we can actually have the economy be generated in the public way again. We'll see how that looks. How are delivery zones going to be reallocated for people? How are, 2-hour parking or business district parking areas going to be reallocated for expansion of business districts? And that's a tricky situation that we're in right now because we need to balance people being able to get places with people being able to create destinations that are able to regenerate the economy, because we need to get back to economic recovery probably as much as we need to get back to health recovery. Because though we are dealing still with the health pandemic, the ripple effect of the economic impact is going to be broadly felt overall. So that's just something to think about into phase four. And then lastly, phase five, which we have yet to really see anybody lock into place here, but we have essential workers who have been working since day one of this pandemic that have needed to get to places without needing a single occupancy vehicle. Transit ridership on buses and subway cars has dropped to about 90 to 95% of what it used to be, dropped 90 to 95%. So we're at about a 5% train and bus usage, which is slowly ticking its way back up as people are going back to work. But people are fearful of using transit And the one thing that we cannot have come back is the congestion and the greenhouse gas emissions that come from single occupancy vehicles. So our big push right now is to say, hey, our transportation network needs to be sustainable. How do we actually build a through regional network? Not just bits and pieces, not just at the parks, not just at the business districts, but say you want to go from Harvard Square to Longwood. What is going to be your protected biking network? And I don't think we figured that out. Again, because there's a lot of multi-jurisdictional problems just trying to get to the, 2 institutional pieces of Harvard. You have to go through the multi-layers of jurisdictions. But also it's really tough because we're still competing with the balance that our streets are narrow. And it is kind of a zero-sum game of sidewalk edge to sidewalk edge. So what's going to have to give? And no one has really stepped up with a political will to say, you know what, we're going to get rid of all on-street parking in that corridor so that our essential workers who might be, janitorial staff in the laboratories who are studying COVID, but yet need to also go up to, the Red Line and Harvard Square, actually have a safe and protected network. That is yet to kind of fall into place yet. So we're still kind of waiting on phase 5. Cool. Just to jump around again, one of the last things I'll talk about before I get into the bike infrastructure conversation is safe routes to schools. This is also a very big concern of what's happening out right now, along with the concept of essential workers needing to get to work from home to work. We need to get kids to school. We need to open up schools to some extent. We all agree on that. But we are very fearful of giving them the big yellow school buses again if there is going to be transmission that takes place. So just to throw this out there, this is a problem that we're tackling at Mass Bike statewide, and it's a local problem. And this is just my Newton example, because Newton actually has a very robust Safe Routes to Schools task force. But we have 2 examples here. Both are what we are potentially seeing. We are at the top of everybody dropping their kid off to school again. We can't have that happen. We just don't have the space. We don't have the street infrastructure and the parking infrastructure for every single kid to be brought to school in a minivan and an SUV. I'm sorry, as much as that would be preferred for public safety, it really makes the streets that much more unsafe. We need kids to be able to get to school on their own biking or walking. How do we do that? We need to create corridors of safe biking and safe walking to schools. We can create walking school buses. We can create corridors and walking routes. But this is also one of the biggest problems that we're facing. For those of you who are tuning in who have kids at home, I know you're racking your brain to say, how are we going to deal with this? This is something that Mass Bike is trying to tackle. We're out there fighting for you, working with you. The way that we're trying to push this is for each school to really designate safe biking and walking routes that can partner with parents to either have a designated school bus, walking school bus and biking to school bus route, or maybe there's a satellite drop-off that's away from the school that the kids can then walk and bike to school safely. It's complex because every district is particular to its own. So we work with the Safe Routes to Schools program to do programming and also identify corridors of safe biking and walking to schools. So plug in with Mass Bike if this is a concern of yours, but this is a huge concern of ours right now. And we're trying to build, again, this kind of concept of fast tracking COVID recovery, overlapping that conversation with the Safe Routes to Schools conversation too. And if we could just get some barrels out, if we could just get some planters out, if we could just get some cheap bollards out around a school to make it safer for your kid to cross the street, that is the priority for us right now. Cool. With that, there's one more slide I forgot to mention, particularly, of course, to what happened in Harvard Square yesterday as well. Crashes happen, and we don't have much information as to the incident that happened yesterday. Crash investigations take about a year plus to come out. Sadly, we are at 5 fatalities throughout the state so far this year. Overall, last year, we had 5 fatalities over the course of the whole year. So right now, we are on track to really have a hard year with fatal crashes out there. A few recommendations if you crash. This is also on our website. If you want to go to massbike.org under our resources tab, it's under if you crash. But the main 6 points are: 1, make sure you're safe. identify principals and witnesses in the crash, check out your bike, check out your body, make sure you're good. If you think the crash is worth more than $100, you really need to get a police report on site. That's state law. If you want to follow up with an insurance company, it also makes it that much easier with an insurance company. If you want to get damages and injury compensation, then you really need to have a police officer with a police report. And then there's a conversation about whether you want an insurance company to just pay out for the crashes and the damages, or if you do need a lawyer up. I don't think this is an easy conversation. It's not that straightforward as I'm making it on the slide. So it really is a conversation to be had with a lawyer. But the 6 real things to consider, especially in the immediate time of a crash: make sure you're safe, make sure you've got contact information of witnesses and other principals that are in that crash, make sure that you've got an initial estimate of how you are and your bike is, and that you get a report on site so that you can follow up. Our hearts go out to the victims and the families of those who are involved in serious and fatal crashes. I'll talk in a minute about the legislation that we're working on in terms of some of the large trucks in urban areas, but just so you know that there are some resources out there if you or someone you know is involved in a crash. And some of the legislation that we're working on, which would help mitigate some of that problem. One of the main pieces of legislation that we have at MassBike that's out there, it's called an Act to Reduce Traffic Fatalities. It's currently stalled in the House of Representatives, sitting in the Ways and Means. It's hard to get legislation through, especially in COVID times, but we've got some wind behind us because we've actually put this out this year. It's made its way through the Transportation Committee. It's sitting in the Ways and Means. And what that would do, it would require, with an Act to Reduce Traffic Fatalities, it would require a 3-foot passing distance of 30 miles an hour, 40 miles an hour, 50 miles an hour. It goes 3-foot passing, 4-foot passing, and 5-foot passing, not just for bicyclists, but for state troopers who are writing tickets on the side of the road, for tow truck drivers who are out there on the side of the road, anybody who will be passed by a moving vehicle at a speed differential. If the car is going 30 plus miles an hour, there needs to be a 3-foot or 4-foot or 5-foot passing. It would mandate that trucks would need a side guard, would need basically a protective panel on the side of the truck, which would mitigate some of that right hook problem, or a bicyclist or a pedestrian from getting caught under the rear wheels of a tractor trailer, which may have been part of the cause of yesterday. We know that the bicyclist was caught in the rear wheels, on the side wheels of the tractor trailer. And typically blind spots of tractor trailers are where the parallel of the bed, the truck bed is. And it would standardize crash data reporting throughout the state. So we would actually, as advocates, get a good handle on how many and how severe crashes are for bicyclists and pedestrians throughout the whole state. If you can believe it, we do not have a good reporting structure happening out there. So that's one thing that bill will handle. We did get hands-free cell phone use while driving passed and enacted into law last November. So it is now illegal to have a mobile device in your hand. So our job now is to make sure that enforcement and education can back up that law. We're working on e-bike legislation. We're working on RMV training. We're working on expanded funding that the State House can help out with for the paths and trails. And we're working on complete streets programming that we were talking about. A lot of bike laws take years to go through. And then on top of that, you need the administration to enact regulations and enforcement around them. The first step generally are the laws. So for instance, complete streets is a law. Crash reporting would be a law. Hands-free cell phone use is a law. It is hard to get legislation passed, but I will say that we have a pretty robust state house that works year-round. So we're lucky in Massachusetts for that. We actually have some pretty good bike laws already on the books. This is a lot of what MassBike does, is to make sure that we have a foundation and a backbone that can be backed up with regulations and funding. So plug in with what MassBike is doing at massbike.org to follow some of our legislation, and to keep in mind that It's a slow boat. It's a very big process to maneuver, but we're on it. We're in that conversation, and we are the player to make sure that happens. So if you want to help us out, please plug in with our work. I'll touch very, very briefly on electric bicycles because that's something that is just going on right now. What we need to do right now is actually define electric bicycles so they can be used. This is kind of for commuting purposes, and I'm realizing for the interest of time, I'm going to breeze through this slide. Basically, e-bikes are being ridden right now on our streets and pathways, but it's a gray area as to whether they fit in the bicycle category or the moped category. Mopeds are defined already in state law because of the 1970s. There was a lot of mopeds, so the state decided to define them. We haven't re-upped the law since. What MassBike is trying to do very simply is to create a three-tier classification for e-bikes, which would follow the federal regulations and follow what's going on mostly around the country. We are one of 7 states that does not have sensible e-bike legislation. Even something so easy as just defining e-bikes is proving to be a pulling teeth process at the state house level. So we're working on it. It's one of the many things we're working on. I just want to throw this slide up just to get a sense of where we're at legislatively there. Okay, I'm going to breeze on, take a quick pause. I want to take, about less than 10 minutes to go through the different types of bike infrastructure. And then I'm going to skip the last part of my presentation, which talks about bike and car crashes, because I generally cover that in other presentations that I've given with Harvard. But I just want to say, before I move on, that there's a ton of information in this presentation. So I don't want to lose anybody, and I want to be cognizant of the fact that we're all zoomed out these days. So if there's anything that you want me to particularly cover, I'm going to make this slides and all these slides available to Cassidy and the crew to share afterwards. So though there are literally all of these types of examples that I have, I'm not going to really go into detail on any of them, just so you know that there are lots of different types of bike infrastructure out there that have different purposes and different needs. But if there's anything that I've already covered that you want any clarification on, now is the time to throw that in the Q&A and to feel free to interrupt me. Great. Well, with that, I'm just gonna, literally, it's gonna make your eyes gloss over here, but just so you know, there's a ton of information that's out there here. So along these lines, we have basically different types of infrastructure fit different types of roadways for different needs of cycling. I'll start with what is the share route. Oh, actually, I'll start with the 4 types of riders. This is the framework with which all of these types of infrastructure fit. 4 types of riders that MassBike has kind of, this is like the, not real data, but kind of my mantra that I printed out and put above my computer. We've got, generally conceive of a whole pie chart that we're splitting up into percentages. We've got the less than 1% of riders who will ride in any condition, whether it's traffic, weather, day, time of year, whatever, we're out riding. Then we've got the 7%, which on a good day will be riding to campus. 7% actually is kind of like a good number, which is Cambridge on a good day is about 9% of the general population of commuters are riding by bike. Then there's that 30% of never gonna do it, not interested. I walk, I take a train, I drive, not gonna do it. But it's that 60% of the population would love to ride, we're very interested, but they're concerned. So a lot of the reasons that they're concerned is going back to that stress level of the streets, mainly because the streets are stressful. Streets are stressful because of traffic. So how can we really build our infrastructure to mitigate the conflicts between biking and driving? So a lot of this at this point, 7 minutes of the presentation will be how bicyclists and drivers mesh, are separated, and the gray areas and varieties in between. And here, my goal is at far, far left, is that kid with the helmet on the 20-inch wheel bike, what would make them want to ride to school? So getting back to that safe routes to school slide, what would help them ride to class from home on their own without the dangers or the perceived dangers of mixing with traffic? And to put into context everything that I was just talking about from the first slide to here, in order to get that infrastructure, we need to deal with so many different agencies. We need to deal with so many different funding sources, with so many different contextualizations of advocacy campaigns, of cultural contexts, of timeliness, of everything that kind of layers into building bike infrastructure. And again, this presentation really is geared around lanes. What's up with that bike lane? There's a lot up with that bike lane. And again, the goal of where we want to get to is that far left, even though a lot of our roads and pathways might be leaning a little bit more towards that right. But I want to get to that tier 1, get to that 60%, get them right, and get those barriers down. So let's begin. This is the lightning round here. We have the Share Row. The Share Row is a mixed use mark to say that bicyclists and drivers are going to be sharing the same place. Don't worry about reading these slides. I'll make them available afterwards. Doesn't do anything to separate the modes. And then we got a bike lane. A bike lane is great because it kind of designates a place for bicyclists to ride the same direction as traffic. Generally, it keeps traffic a little bit further out, so it provides a space towards the right where slower traffic should be anyway. However, it also puts bikers in what's called the door zone. So it's not necessarily any sort of real separation. And though it's a first step in creating bike infrastructure, it is by no means an end game. It doesn't actually protect physically. Then we got what I call a puffered bike lane, which is a paint buffer. It's not any real separation. It's just a little bit of a puffed up bike lane. You can see that in this example too, just kind of goes into a parked car. I do like puffered bike lanes though, because it definitely provides a little bit more separation. It's got the perceived sense of safety, even though it doesn't actually provide any real physical separation. Where there is space, we are seeing a little bit of a puffer. The 5 foot is the minimum allowable bike lane width. However, if you can add a foot in or 2 of a puffer, that's great. Now we're seeing more though that those puffers can also be enough space to have a parking flip, which is what we're seeing in Cambridge. This is an example of Prospect Park in Brooklyn. So you can imagine this as part of Brattle Street or up in Cambridge Street by Harvard. But the parking protected bike lanes are great because they actually provide a physical separation, though there is a little bit of concern amongst the advocates because this does rile up people, because when you start to mess with parking, you get a lot of different tougher strategic conversations, especially from abutters. For instance, say you run an apothecary and you're going to have a geriatric clientele. Yeah, elderly folk and seniors are concerned about having to step out of their car into moving traffic or having to walk across a bike lane with the fear of getting hit by bikers. So pros and cons for each of these here, but generally a parking protected bike lane is great because there's actually physical separation. You can also get physical separation with bollards. Simple, easy flex posts. If you can have enough room for a puffer, you can have enough room for a bollard. Trouble with bollards is they get run over, or in snow, they get plowed over. But this is what we're pushing a little bit more, because a little bit of vertical separation, for those of you who ride out there, goes a long way. To be honest, getting back to the slide, would your 8-year-old feel comfortable in a puffered bike lane? If it had a bollard, that 8-year-old might feel a little bit more comfortable. Then we have a 2-way separated bike lane. These are a little bit more complex because you do have to deal with wrong way bikers, right way bikers, a little bit more complexity of the bike etiquette. I will say though that when you start to build in a complexity of bike lanes, typically you build in more robust infrastructure, which then requires bicyclists to generally follow the rules of the road, where when you get back to just a share row or even no infrastructure, it's a little bit more anarchy out there. And all those complaints about those darn bikers running red lights, if you actually design a roadway with a proper separated infrastructure with a light cycle that is specific for the speeds of bicyclists, you see bicyclists starting to follow the rules of the road that much more. So it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg. Get the infrastructure out that's built for bicyclists, then they start to follow that infrastructure a little bit more robustly. Cool. But a 2-way separated bike lane is also a really nice addition, because it also requires a little bit less space out there if you can combine those 2 ways, because a bicyclist becomes a little bit more maneuverable. And then practically a bicyclist can leave that yellow line or even leave the entire bike lane and go into the travel lane. I should also preface this by saying there is nothing in state law that requires a bicyclist to stay in a bike lane if it's adjacent to the street. If a bicyclist is allowed on the roadway, a bicyclist is allowed on the roadway. Then you get bus bike lanes. These are more and more common, especially as we are combining our zero-sum street space with MBTA traffic. Part of what Mass Bike wants to do is mode shift. And, I'm not expecting somebody to be a bicyclist 100% of the time. I want you to feel multimodal. I want you to drive when you choose to, walk safely when you choose to, be able to take a bike when you choose to, and bike when you choose to, all safely, reasonably at the same expense without it being a safety hazard for one and being as attractive as possible. So typically we are in favor of bus bike lanes organizationally. However, they do come out with complexities because a MBTA bus driver needs to basically go at the same speed as a biker. And we are working at Mass Bike with partnering with the City of Cambridge and Livable Streets Alliance, another advocacy organization, to work on the drivers training on MBTA bus drivers. So there's an also opportunity to be more robust in our advocacy here. But you're seeing bus bike lanes pop up more and more, specifically around the Harvard Law School. Contraflow bike lanes, first ever Contraflow bike lane that I'm familiar with in the area was on Garden Street in Harvard, on the way coming into Harvard's campus by the Cambridge Common. Basically allows cyclists to go the wrong way legally, and it's a sign for cyclists that it's okay. It's a sign for drivers to make a little bit more space, that bikers are going to go the wrong way. Only when there's a Contraflow bike lane do we advocate for bicyclists to go against the flow of traffic. And there's complexities to this because drivers might not be expecting you that way, but it's a tool in the toolbox. Then there's a left side bike lane. This is an example from Manhattan. For better or worse, you can see that people are not paying attention to it. So that pedestrian right there, she's going to walk right into the front of that guy with the kid. So keep an eye out when you're thinking of a left side bike lane. People aren't used to it. You see these a little bit, not necessarily around Harvard's area, but on Com Ave by the Back Bay and some other places, you'll see left side bike lanes. The cons is that they're just not familiar to a lot of people. Bike signals. In wayfinding, this goes back to my if you build it, we'll follow the rules conversation. This is really great to normalize routing and normalize behaviors. If you are bicyclists and you see a specific bike red, chances are you're going to stop a lot more than if you just see a no turn on red sign that's designed for car drivers. The way of building better infrastructure is to make it holistic and fully. It's not good enough just to put a striped white bike lane. You really have to think about an entire network. So all of these different types of infrastructure might be faced on your one commute. You might hit a share row, you might hit a bike lane, you might hit a wrong way. So you need to know how to navigate these. And the beauty of finding a wayfinding is that planners can build a regional holistic view of how a cyclist will navigate, and allows us to kind of say, hey, cyclist, we built this for you for a reason. We're even going to build you directional signs. It's going to be a lot easier if you choose to use this route. So you'll see, for instance, when you're coming off of Garden Street, if you hang a right and go down, I can't remember the name, it's maybe Church Street or around there, that's a lot easier than continuing Garden into the square if your ultimate destination is to go to the Charles River. Box turns, these are a little more tricky. These are ways to make a left turn, and I'll demonstrate in a second that there's a variety of ways of doing infrastructure, or intersections, I mean. There's a bike box, which provides a little bit more space for the bicyclist to get out in front of a driver so that they're more visible. It's similar to a lead pedestrian interval, which I'll talk about in a second. A box turn on the bottom image is a way to go straight, turn your bike, wait for the light cycle, and go straight again. So it removes you as a cyclist from crossing any moving traffic if you want to make a left turn. Different purposes, different intersections, different levels of stress. These are not really commonplace, and they're not really standardized to be put in any design guides. So a lot of people are like, what's up with that? Just so you know that these are out there. It's basically that middle image there of a two-stage left of going straight, turning, and then going straight again. It's just a way to get through an intersection without having to cross over moving traffic. Lead pedestrian intervals, these are throughout Cambridge. Basically, it's that 6 seconds before the light turns green that allows a pedestrian to get out in an intersection, which hopefully prevents a driver from turning into them. It allows the driver to see the pedestrian, and actually gives the pedestrian the right of way so that they're in the crosswalk legally, which prevents the drivers from coming through. Legally, a cyclist has to wait for the green light, but practically a lot of cyclists do use the LPI. Mass Bike does not advocate necessarily to break the law, but we do advocate for whatever is safest out there. So if it's safer for you to get out in front, just know that you're in a gray area of the law. But LPIs, lead pedestrian intervals, are commonplace out there, mainly in the city of Cambridge. It's another tool in the toolkit. A shared street, we talked about them a little earlier, but this is about basically opening up streets for people. That bottom image is from Massachusetts. That's actually the only example of what I call a Woonerf, which is a Dutch term for a living street. It's very common in the Netherlands. You might think of downtown crossing, but I don't really think downtown crossing really is that effective. Or that little strip, I'm forgetting the name, but it basically is by Charlie's Kitchen and connects by Pete's Coffee right in Harvard Square too. That would be a quote Woonerf. But the real Woonerfs out there, that's from Provincetown. And the beauty there is that it is a commercial district. It is a slow shared area. So drivers can't be going fast to like fatally hit somebody. You have to go 5 miles an hour as a driver because the street is so complex. And that brings back the point of a street is a public way. Let's use it for people. And then you have separated bike paths. This is the gold standard. You actually have a designated bikeway, which physically removes the bicyclists from drivers on the street with a curb so that there's not even the option of somebody parking in your bike lane. There's not even the option of, of a delivery truck popping in there. You do have to worry about pedestrians wandering in, especially this image here is from MIT's area by Vassar Street. Those MIT kids never look up from their phones, I'll tell you. But it is a safest way to go. And again, would you let your 8-year-old ride on that? Probably, right? If that was their route to school on a separated bike path, you'd probably feel a lot more comfortable. And then, of course, the other gold standard is the multi-use path of just totally out of the street entirely, finding the pathways, finding those Department of Conservation and Recreation pathways. This gets back to that mass trails conversation. Your route might be something that involves all or any of these different types of infrastructure, but just so you know, this is what Mass Bike deals with on a regular basis in terms of our design guidelines. That said, I'm gonna just literally skip over the rest of these, but consider all of these when you're planning your bike route. Mass Bike and Commuter Choice can help you figure out where to go, how to go, and then getting back to some of the stories of avoiding crashes. I won't go into any of this because I've already talked about avoiding crashes, but just so you know, this is the complexities of fighting for a bike lane, type of bike lane infrastructure, the type of funding, the type of municipality, the jurisdictions that goes into advocating for it. And that said, I'm sorry to throw so much at you. I hope that was helpful. And that said, I'll relinquish because I realize my time is up, but I'm happy to hang out for as long as you got me for.
Thanks, Galen. That was a great presentation. This whole last part of your presentation, there's been a very robust discussion in the chat. So I don't know if you want to take a peek at it. I don't know if you can, but basically there was discussion about the frustration, specifically in some spots in Boston where you're biking and there's a great bike lane and you're protected, and then out of nowhere it stops or moves to the left side of the road. So there was there's some frustrations around that, and there was also some back and forth on some good routes to our preferred routes to get to different places in Boston and Cambridge. So that's kind of where we are at the moment. But I don't know, it was a pretty good discussion in the chat, but it was also very informative presentation on your end, and I'm sure everyone will be happy to have those slides that you breezed through.
Yeah, more than happy to share them with you. And I realize I'm definitely pounding you here, so thanks for sticking with me. This is awesome conversation here. I really appreciate this. In terms of the disconnected and disjointed, yeah, that is a problem. And a lot of it comes into how these bike lanes get put down. And unfortunately, it's the advocacy that comes with funding. So in order for instance, the city of Cambridge to build out their protected bike lane network, they have a citywide ordinance that says whenever a street gets redeveloped, if it's in the bike plan and in the bike network, the developer has to build that separated part. But that means it's done parcel by parcel. So you might get a developed parcel here, And then 4 blocks later, you might get a developed parcel there. And, you know, this developer builds that protected bike lane and that developer builds that protected bike lane, but there's not the funding and the incentive to get that connective tissue built. Even though Cambridge has an ordinance and a policy that backs it up, it still is going to take literally the entire city's redevelopment in order for it to come to fruition to actually build a full-on network. And that has always been the case. I don't know a good answer because a lot of these projects go in what's called the scope, where there is like a defined end to the project, where even an inch beyond, even though there might be an obvious connection, if it's not, quote, in the scope, it's not touched by the project team, which is, in my opinion, the most infuriating part. I can use an example of another university institution across the river where BU did it. They put in this great protected bike lane. Through years of advocacy, we were able to get them to go beyond just a single white lane and a door zone.
It looks like we might have lost Galen for a few minutes.